The silence after David's stroke wasn't empty, it hummed with the sound of a life abruptly paused. 3 weeks had passed since he'd collapsed in the grand, sunlit living room of our Manhattan apartment, his favorite jazz record still spinning on the turntable. That quiet, humming silence had become the soundtrack to my days, a constant, low-frequency reminder of a world knocked off its axis. Now, I sat across from Mr. Henderson, our family lawyer for 3 decades, in his suffocatingly oak-paneled office. The afternoon light filtering through the tall, grime-streaked windows was gray and lifeless, painting the room in the muted tones of my own grief. The air, thick with the scent of old paper, stale coffee, and the cloying sweetness of a cheap air freshener, was heavy enough to choke on. My hands, folded tightly in my lap, were ice cold, a stark contrast to the room's stuffy warmth. They felt like a stranger's hands, brittle and useless. Beside me, my son, Tyler, sat rigid in his tailored suit, a perfect, dark silhouette of ambition. His eyes were fixed on the lawyer with that unnerving, predatory intensity he'd inherited from his father, but with none of David's kindness, none of his warmth. He didn't look at me. He hadn't, not really, since the day David died. I could feel his impatience radiating off him like heat from stone, a frantic, vibrating energy that filled the space between us. He was a coiled spring, ready to launch himself into the future. A future that, I was beginning to realize, he had been planning long before his father's last breath. Henderson cleared his throat. A dry, rustling sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. I will now read the last will and testament of David Allen Mercer, he announced, his voice a dusty monotone. He picked up the heavy document, the crinkle of the paper unnaturally loud in the silent, waiting room. Each word he read fell like a stone into the deep, still water of my shock. He spoke of assets I knew well, the building blocks of the life David and I had so carefully constructed, the sprawling Fifth Avenue apartment that had been our home for 30 years, the airy, salt-scented summer house in the Hamptons, the robust investment portfolio that was supposed to be our comfortable, secure future. And with every sentence, my son's name echoed louder and louder. All of it, every square foot of polished hardwood, every share of blue-chip stock, every dollar was left to him. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. This wasn't what we'd planned. David and I had spent countless evenings talking about the future, about a trust for Tyler, yes, but always with the unwavering, unspoken understanding that I would be secure, that my peace, my dignity, mattered. This document, this cold, legal text, was a betrayal of every one of those quiet, late-night conversations. I felt a hot flush of shame, of a sudden, public demotion from partner to dependent. Then came the shift, the part of the will that was meant for me, and to my beloved wife, Claire Mercer, Mr. Henderson said, pausing just a beat too long, a small, almost imperceptible note of pity in his voice. I bequeath the property located at 112 37th Street, Brooklyn, and all its contents. The address landed like a punch to the chest. I knew that place. It was an old, derelict commercial building David had bought decades ago as a speculative investment, a crumbling brick shell in a forgotten, industrial part of the borough. He'd meant to sell it, but never had. It was a joke between us, his Brooklyn folly. It was, for all intents and purposes, a basement. He had left me a basement. My throat closed, a band of ice tightening around my esophagus. I couldn't speak. The room tilted, the edges of my vision blurring, and in that moment of profound, disorienting shock, I heard it. Tyler let out a soft, dismissive huff of air through his nose, a sound barely audible, but as sharp and as clear as the shattering of glass. It was the sound of contempt. It was the sound of victory. Henderson offered a thin, watery smile, avoiding my eyes. That concludes the reading, he said, already beginning to shuffle his papers, eager for this uncomfortable moment to be over. I stood on unsteady legs, my body numb, a stranger in my own life. Outside, the city roared, a vast, indifferent beast. By the time I reached our apartment, his apartment, now dusk had fallen, the city lights beginning to glitter like a handful of scattered, taunting jewels. Tyler was already there, standing by the panoramic window, his back to me, the skyline a glittering, beautiful backdrop to his quiet, cold triumph. You don't need all this space. Mother, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. It's far too large for one person. He finally turned, his eyes as cold and as hard as the glass behind him. Besides, he added, the words a final, casual twist of the knife. What would you even do with a real inheritance? The cruelty wasn't just in the words. It was in the confirmation of a truth I had refused to see. This wasn't just David's doing. Tyler had shaped it. He had twisted it. He had whispered in his father's ear in his final, vulnerable weeks and had made sure I would be cast out, a queen deposed in a silent, bloodless coup. I packed what I could in a haze of numb, silent grief. His assistant, a young woman with a face as efficient and as impersonal as a spreadsheet, handled the rest. My suitcases waited by the door like strangers, artifacts from a life that was no longer mine. As I stepped into the hallway for the last time, the heavy, solid wood door clicked shut behind me. The sound was final. I clutched the slip of paper with the Brooklyn address, the key to my new kingdom. It felt less like a key and more like a sentence. But even in that moment of utter desolation, a quiet, stubborn voice inside me, the voice of the woman who had loved David Mercer for 30 years, whispered a single, defiant thought. David wouldn't do this to me. Not like this. Not without a reason. And that fragile, illogical sliver of trust was the only thing keeping me from breaking completely. The taxi ride to Brooklyn was a journey to another planet. We crossed the bridge from the glittering, vertical world of Manhattan, a landscape of effortless wealth and ambition, into a different kind of city. The streets here were wider, flatter, lined with low-slung industrial buildings and brick warehouses, their walls a canvas of faded advertisements and vibrant, angry graffiti. The air itself was different, heavier, smelling of salt from the nearby docks, of diesel, and of a kind of gritty, weary resilience. The driver, a kind man with a gentle, lilting accent, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, at my expensive coat and the small, leather suitcase at my side. His expression a mixture of curiosity and a quiet, professional pity. He clearly thought I had made a terrible mistake, and as he pulled up to 112 37th Street, I was inclined to agree with him. The building was a ghost, a relic from a forgotten industrial age. It was a 3-story brick warehouse, its windows boarded up, its facade scarred with the graffiti of 100 different artists. The street was deserted, the silence broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a ship's horn from the harbor. This was not just a step down from Fifth Avenue. It was a fall from a great height. My inheritance, a tomb. The lawyer had given me a set of old, heavy keys. I found the one for the main entrance, a large, rusted metal door, and with a strength born of pure, desperate adrenaline, I managed to force it open. The inside was a cavern of darkness, and the thick, suffocating smell of dust, damp, and decay. I fumbled for a light switch, and a single, bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak, yellow, and deeply depressing glow over the scene. The ground floor was a vast, empty space, the concrete floor littered with debris, the ghosts of old machinery still visible in the oil stains and rusted bolts. According to the will, my property was the basement. I found the door, a simple, battered wooden one, and descended a set of steep, rickety stairs into a deeper, colder darkness. The air down here was even thicker, heavy with the scent of mildew and the damp chill of the earth. Another bare bulb revealed my new home. It was a vast, sprawling cellar, its low ceiling a tangled web of pipes and wiring, its stone walls weeping with a steady, quiet dampness. In the center of the room, looking absurdly out of place, was a small, cot-like bed, a simple wooden table, and a single chair. It was the furniture of a monk, or a prisoner. This, I realized with a fresh wave of nausea, was not just a property David had forgotten about. Someone had prepared this space for me. The thought was a chilling, premeditated cruelty that went far beyond simply writing me out of a will. For the first few days, I did little more than exist. The grief, which had been a sharp, clear pain, now mutated into a dull, heavy, and all-consuming despair. I would sleep for hours on the hard, narrow cot, a blessed, dreamless escape from the waking nightmare of my new reality. When I was awake, I would just sit at the small table, staring at the damp stone walls. The silence of the cellar a perfect, echoing reflection of the emptiness inside me. The small, stubborn voice that had whispered of David's hidden reason was now silent, crushed under the overwhelming, physical evidence of his betrayal. He had not just disinherited me. He had exiled me. He had cast me out of our sunlit world and into this cold, dark, underground kingdom of his own making. It was on the fourth day that the despair began to recede, replaced by a slow, creeping boredom, and with it, a flicker of my old, practical self. I could not stay in this tomb forever. I had to do something. I began to explore. The cellar was a labyrinth of forgotten things, a museum of the building's past lives. There were old, rusted tools from a forgotten workshop, stacks of yellowed newspapers from a defunct printing press, the detritus of 100 different failed enterprises. And in the farthest, darkest corner of the cellar, hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates, I found it. It was a small, alcove-like space, its entrance obscured by a heavy, canvas tarp. I pulled the tarp aside. Behind it was not a stone wall, but a securely locked, heavy steel door. It was a vault. My heart began to pound again, this time not with grief, but with a new, electric surge of adrenaline and curiosity. I tried the keys the lawyer had given me. None of them fit. For an hour, I worked at the door with a crowbar I had found. My hands, once accustomed to the delicate work of arranging flowers, now raw and bleeding. Finally, with a loud, groaning shriek of protesting metal, the lock gave way. I pulled the heavy door open. The space inside was not large, perhaps the size of a walk-in closet. It was bone dry and pitch black. I shone the flashlight from my phone inside, its bright, white beam cutting through the darkness. And then I saw them, leaning against the back wall, carefully wrapped in protective, oilcloth coverings, were three large, rectangular objects. My first thought was that they were mirrors. I reached in, my fingers closing around the edge of the nearest one, and I pulled it out into the dim light of the cellar. I unwrapped the cloth, and my breath caught in my throat. It was not a mirror. It was a painting, and I recognized it instantly. It was Anne O'Keeffe, a magnificent, vibrant, and utterly unmistakable Georgia O'Keeffe, a desert landscape of impossible, beautiful color. My hands trembling, I unwrapped the other two. An Edward Hopper, a stark, lonely, and heartbreakingly beautiful cityscape, and a Jackson Pollock, a chaotic, vibrant, and brilliant explosion of pure, unadulterated energy. They were not prints. They were real, and they were masterpieces. David had not left me a basement. He had left me a vault, and I was beginning to understand that the will had not been an act of cruelty. It had been a map. I stood in the dim, dusty light of the cellar, surrounded by a fortune that was both breathtaking and utterly incomprehensible. The three masterpieces, leaning against the damp stone wall, seemed to glow with an internal, impossible light. An O'Keeffe, a Hopper, a Pollock. It was not just a collection of valuable paintings. It was a curated exhibition of the American soul, its vast, lonely landscapes, its stark, urban solitude, its chaotic, vibrant, and untamable energy. And it was all mine. The initial, dizzying wave of shock and euphoria slowly began to recede, replaced by a single, overwhelming, and deeply unsettling question. Why? Why this elaborate, theatrical, and incredibly cruel charade? Why would David, the kind, straightforward, and honest man I had loved for 30 years, subject me to the public humiliation of the will reading, to the despair of this cold, damp cellar, only to leave me a secret? $1 billion treasure hunt? The logic of it eluded me. If he had wanted to protect this fortune for me, why not just leave it to me in a simple, private trust? Why the drama? Why the pain? The man who had done this, the man who had orchestrated this complex, posthumous game, was a stranger to me, a brilliant, cold, and calculating strategist I did not recognize. The doubt that had been a faint, stubborn whisper in my heart was now a roaring, confusing chorus. I had been right. David wouldn't have done this to me without a reason. But the reason, I was beginning to fear, was something far more complex and perhaps far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. My search for answers began with the vault itself. Tucked away in the back, behind where the Pollock had been leaning, was a small, flat, metal document box. It was not locked. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, yellowing legal documents, was a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. My name, Claire, was written on the front in David's familiar, elegant, and now heartbreakingly final script. This was it. The key to the entire, insane puzzle. I took the envelope back to the small, wooden table, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. I sat for a long moment, just looking at my name in his handwriting. A final message from a man I no longer knew. With a deep, steadying breath, I broke the seal. The letter inside was not long, just a few pages, every line a testament to the man I had loved. My dearest Claire, it began. If you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am gone, and for that, my love, I am more sorry than words can ever say. And second, it means that you are exactly as smart, as resilient, and as resourceful as I always knew you were. You found your way here. You followed the map. I knew you would. His words were a strange and beautiful comfort. A ghost's hand reaching out to squeeze my own. He went on to explain. The paintings were real, a collection he had secretly and painstakingly acquired over decades. A passion he had kept hidden not out of a desire for secrecy, but out of a quiet, humble love for the art itself. They were, he wrote, his true legacy, his real fortune, a fortune he had always intended for me. But then, his tone in the letter shifted. It became harder, colder, more pragmatic. I am leaving this for you here, in this cold, unlikely place, for one reason, and one reason only. Tyler. He wrote of his dawning, heartbreaking realization in the final years of his life that our son, the boy he adored, had become a man he did not recognize. He wrote of Tyler's insatiable ambition, his casual cruelty, his growing, corrosive sense of entitlement. He had seen the way Tyler looked at me, with a dismissive, condescending pity, as if I were a piece of old, comfortable furniture to be discarded in his new, modern life. And he had seen, with a father's terrible, clear-eyed grief, that if he left his fortune to me directly, Tyler would have found a way to take it. He would have manipulated me, bullied me, or, if necessary, challenged my competency in court, painting me as a grieving, unstable widow who could not be trusted with her own affairs. The public humiliation of the will, David explained, was a necessary cruelty. It was a performance, a piece of theater designed to convince Tyler, and the world, that I had been left with nothing, that I was a powerless, penniless victim, not worthy of his attention. It was a shield, a way to make me invisible, so that I could disappear with the real inheritance, unnoticed. And then came the final, devastating revelation, the one that explained everything, the one that made the world, once again, stop on its axis. I am writing this, he wrote, because my doctors have given me 6 months. It is a tumor, my love, inoperable. I have told no one. I will not spend my final days as an invalid, a subject of pity. I will live the life we built, with you, for as long as I can, and I will use the time I have left to build you a new one. The letter fell from my numb fingers. The stroke. It hadn't been a random, cruel act of fate. It had been the inevitable, final chapter of a story he had kept hidden from me. A final act of protection. A final, terrible, and beautifully loving sacrifice. He had orchestrated his own final act, and in doing so, had tried to orchestrate a safe, new beginning for me. I looked at the paintings, at their impossible, beautiful colors. They were not just a treasure. They were a testament to a love so profound, so forward-thinking, so utterly and completely devoted, that it had reached across the silence of death itself to save me. David's letter was not just an explanation. It was a roadmap, tucked into the back of the metal document box. Beneath a sheaf of authentication papers for the paintings was a second, smaller envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a set of keys and a single, printed address for a house in a small, quiet town in Cape Cod I had never heard of. The town, Chatham, was a place we had talked of visiting one day, a distant, romantic someday that had never materialized in our busy city lives. The note attached was simple, written in David's familiar, steady hand. This is not a palace, my love. It is a beginning. Go, live, be happy. For the next week, the dusty, damp cellar in Brooklyn became my command center. The initial, overwhelming wave of grief and shock at David's diagnosis gave way to a quiet, focused sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was the executor of his final, brilliant, and deeply loving gambit. I contacted a small, discreet art logistics company, one David had mentioned in his letter, and arranged for the secure and anonymous transport of the 3 masterpieces to a specialized art storage facility in a neutral location. Watching them being carefully crated and taken away was a strange, heart-wrenching moment. They were my fortune, my security, but they were also the last, tangible pieces of David's secret passion. With the paintings secured, I packed my few belongings, left the keys to the Brooklyn cellar on the small wooden table, and walked out of that strange, subterranean chapter of my life without a backward glance. The journey to Cape Cod was a pilgrimage toward a future I could not yet imagine. I drove through the dense, urban sprawl of the East Coast, the landscape slowly transforming from concrete and steel to the soft, green, and windswept beauty of the New England coastline. I arrived in Chatham in the late afternoon. It was a picture postcard town, with gray shingled houses, white picket fences, and the sharp, clean, salty scent of the Atlantic in the air. The house was located on a quiet, sandy lane, a short walk from the ocean. It was not the grand, imposing architecture of our Manhattan life. It was a simple, elegant, and beautifully understated cottage, its cedar shingles weathered to a soft, silvery gray by the salt and the sun. It was the kind of house I had always dreamed of, a house that felt like a quiet, comfortable exhalation. I used the key David had left me. The lock turned smoothly. I stepped inside. The house was not empty. It was furnished, not with the cold, modern pieces of our city apartment, but with warm, comfortable, and deeply personal furniture. I recognized the old, worn armchair from David's university days, the one I had always teased him about. I saw the familiar, hand-woven rug we had bought on a trip to New Mexico 20 years ago. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the shelves were filled with all of my favorite books. And he had been building this place for me, piece by piece, over the last year of his life. A secret, parallel act of creation. He had been furnishing our someday house, a quiet, final love letter written in furniture and books. In the kitchen, the cupboards were stocked. On the small, wooden dining table, there was a vase with a single, perfect white rose, and a simple, handwritten note from a local florist. "Welcome, Mrs. Mercer. These are from a standing order. We trust you'll find everything to your liking." He had thought of everything. He had not just left me a house. He had left me a home, a soft, warm, and waiting place to land. That evening, as I was still wandering through the house, touching the familiar objects, my heart a mixture of a profound, aching grief and a deep, overwhelming gratitude. There was a soft knock at the door. An older woman with kind, intelligent eyes and a warm, welcoming smile stood on my porch, holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "You must be Claire," she said, her voice a gentle, welcoming sound. "I'm Eleanor Vance, your neighbor. I just baked a fresh loaf of sourdough. I thought you might like some." The simple, neighborly gesture, so out of place in my former, anonymous city life, almost brought me to tears. She told me that David had been a regular visitor for the past year, a quiet, kind man who had told the small, close-knit community that his wife, a writer, would be joining him soon. Once she finished her latest project, he had not just built me a house. He had built me a community, a network of kind, unsuspecting souls who were already prepared to welcome me as one of their own. I realized then the true genius and the profound, heartbreaking depth of David's plan. The fortune was not in the paintings. The paintings were just the means to an end. They were the fuel. The true inheritance was this. It was the freedom. It was the peace. It was this beautiful, simple, and utterly priceless gift of a new, unwritten life. A life away from the shadows of my son's ambition and the cold, hard memory of a city that had taken my husband from me. I had been left a basement, yes, but it had been the starting point of a map that had led me here, to this quiet, salt-scented sanctuary, to a new beginning I never knew I wanted, but which my husband, in his final, wisest act of love, knew I so desperately needed. The first few weeks in Cape Cod were a healing balm on a raw, open wound. The rhythm of my life slowed to the gentle, steady pace of the tides. My days were filled with long, solitary walks on the windswept beach, the salty air a clean, purifying force, washing away the grime and the grief of the city. I spent my afternoons exploring the quiet, winding lanes of Chatham, discovering the small, independent bookstore, the local fish market, the quiet cafe where the locals gathered for coffee and conversation. My new neighbor, Eleanor Vance, became a quiet, steady presence in my life, a woman of deep, understated wisdom who seemed to understand, without my ever having to say a word, that I was a woman rebuilding herself from the ground up. I was not just healing. I was becoming a different person, a person I was only just beginning to know. I had, of course, been in contact with a lawyer, a sharp, discreet professional recommended by the art logistics company. She had confirmed what David's letter had promised. The paintings were mine, legally and indisputably. They were a separate asset, purchased through a private trust he had established years ago, completely firewalled from his marital and corporate finances. They were a secret, parallel fortune, a silent testament to his foresight. The lawyer's advice was simple: sell one of them, discreetly, through a private auction house. The proceeds, she had explained, would be more than enough to secure my financial independence for the rest of my life. I had agreed, and the process was set in motion, a quiet, behind-the-scenes transfer of immense wealth that felt as abstract and as distant as a dream. The dream, however, was about to collide with the harsh, ugly reality of my old life. The call came on a bright, sunny Tuesday morning. It was Tyler. His voice was not the usual, cool, and dismissive tone he had used with me since his father's death. It was a voice I had not heard in years, a voice laced with a hot, furious, and almost childlike rage. "Where are you?" he demanded, foregoing any pretense of a greeting. "And what have you done?" I knew, with a sudden, sinking feeling, that the secret was out. The pre-auction valuation of the paintings, a necessary step in the legal process, had been flagged in a high net worth asset database, a digital tripwire that had alerted the financial world and my son to the existence of the collection. He had found me. It had not been difficult. He had the resources of a multi-million-dollar estate at his command. He had hired a private investigator who had tracked the art transport, my rental car, my entire journey from the Brooklyn cellar to this quiet, seaside sanctuary. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Don't go anywhere. We are going to have a talk." And then he hung up. The piece I had so carefully, so painstakingly, begun to build was about to be shattered. He arrived the next day, his sleek, expensive sports car a garish, alien object on the quiet, sandy lane. He stood on my porch, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. He looked around at the simple, understated beauty of the cottage, his eyes filled with a new, venomous suspicion. "What is this place?" he hissed. "And what are these paintings I'm hearing about?" I led him inside, my own heart a steady, calm, and surprisingly fearless rhythm in my chest. This was not the broken, grieving woman he had cast out of her own home a month ago. This was a different woman, a woman who had a home of her own. I told him the truth. I told him about the cellar, about the vault, about the paintings. I told him about his father's letter, about his diagnosis, about the brilliant, heartbreaking, and deeply loving plan he had put in motion to protect me. I laid the story bare, expecting, perhaps foolishly, that the revelation of his father's love and sacrifice might break through his armor of greed. But I was wrong. He did not hear a story of love. He heard a story of betrayal. He hid them from me, Tyler whispered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, monstrous sense of entitlement. He hid a fortune from his own son. He began to pace the small living room like a caged tiger, his rage now directed not at me, but at the ghost of his father. "We have to sell them," he said, his mind already calculating, strategizing. "All of them. We'll be the most powerful art collectors in the country. The Mercer collection. It has a ring to it, doesn't it?" He spoke of we, of our new future, as if the last month had been nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. And in that moment, I saw him for what he truly was. I saw not my son, but a hollowed-out vessel of his father's worst ambitions. A man so consumed by the pursuit of more that he had lost the ability to feel anything at all. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes narrowing. What did you say? I said no, I repeated. The paintings are mine, Tyler, and they are not for you. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, the same dismissive sound I had heard in the lawyer's office. Don't be ridiculous, mother, he sneered. You wouldn't know what to do with that kind of money. You'll be advised by me. I looked at him, at the handsome, cruel face of the stranger my son had become, and I felt a profound, aching pity. It wasn't about the money, Tyler, I said softly. It was about the love, your father's love for me. It was a gift, and you are not going to touch it. The finality in my voice, a tone of absolute, unshakable authority he had never heard from me before, finally, truly, registered. The confrontation he had come for was over, and he had lost. Tyler left my small cottage that day in a storm of impotent fury. The sound of his sports car's engine, a roar of frustration and bruised ego, was a jarring, violent intrusion into the quiet, salt-scented air of Chatham. I watched him go, not with a sense of triumph, but with a deep, aching sadness. I had not won a battle. I had simply confirmed the loss of the son I thought I knew. The kind, gentle boy who had, somewhere along the way, been consumed by the ambitious, hollow man he had become. I knew he would not let it go. His father had taught him to see the world as a series of acquisitions, and the paintings, my paintings, were the ultimate prize, an asset he believed was his by birthright. I knew he would fight me, and I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the stones on the nearby beach, that I was ready in the weeks that followed. The war began, just as David had predicted. It was not a war of angry phone calls, but a cold, clinical, and brutal legal assault. Tyler, using the vast resources of his father's estate, hired a team of high-powered, predatory lawyers. The legal notices began to arrive, a steady, relentless stream of paper threats. They contested the trust David had established for the paintings, claiming he was not of sound mind when he created it. They argued that the paintings were marital assets, that I had no right to them. They tried to paint me as a manipulative, greedy woman, a gold digger who had somehow tricked a dying man into giving her his fortune. It was a grotesque, ugly inversion of the truth, a narrative so twisted it was almost a work of art in itself. But David, my brilliant, forward-thinking David, had been 2 steps ahead. The trust he had created was an ironclad, legal fortress. The documentation was meticulous, the timeline of the purchases clear, the paper trail of his private, separate funds indisputable. My lawyer, a sharp, formidable woman who seemed to relish the fight, dismantled their arguments one by one. The legal battle, which Tyler had intended to be a swift, brutal campaign to crush me into submission, became a slow, grinding, and incredibly expensive war of attrition. A war that he was, to his dawning, horrified disbelief, losing. I followed the news of his life from a safe, sad distance, through the hushed, concerned phone calls of old family friends and the glossy, unforgiving pages of the city's society columns. His descent was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, self-inflicted implosion. Consumed by his legal battle with me, his own work, the management of his father's firm, began to suffer. He made a series of reckless, aggressive investments, trying to quickly generate the kind of spectacular wealth that would make the paintings irrelevant. But his gambles, stripped of his father's quiet wisdom and steady hand, were not strategic. They were desperate. They failed, one after another, in a cascade of spectacular, public flameouts. He began to sell off the assets David had left him to fund his legal crusade against me. The Hampton summer house was the first to go. Then came the art collection from the apartment, the portfolio of stocks, each sale a desperate, frantic attempt to keep his lawyers paid and his pride intact. His wife, Rebecca, a woman whose loyalty, I now realized, had been to a lifestyle, not to a man, began to distance herself. The society columns, which had once celebrated their status as the city's new power couple, now whispered of their increasingly frequent and increasingly public arguments. The call came on a cold, rainy evening in late autumn, 6 months after our confrontation in my cottage. It was not from Tyler. It was from Rebecca. Her voice, usually so smooth and confident, was a thin, ragged, and desperate sound. "He's gone, Claire," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's lost everything. The apartment, the firm, it's all gone. He just sits in his father's old office, in the dark. He won't talk to me. He won't talk to anyone." She was not calling to ask for money. She was calling out of a genuine, terrified concern for the man she had married. She was calling for help. 2 days later, I drove back to the city. I stood before the grand, imposing entrance to the Fifth Avenue apartment building, a place that had been my home for 30 years. The doorman, who had known me for decades, looked at me with a sad, pitying expression. I rode the silent, wood-paneled elevator up to the penthouse. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The apartment, once a vibrant, sunlit space filled with art and life, was a tomb. The beautiful furniture was gone, repossessed. The walls were bare, the outlines of the sold paintings a gallery of ghosts. And in the center of the vast, empty living room, sitting on the floor in the dark, was my son. He was a silhouette against the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. A king in the ruins of his own, self-destroyed kingdom. He did not look up when I entered. He just sat there, a broken man in a hollowed-out life. The silence between us filled with the deafening, roaring sound of his failure. I stood in the doorway of the vast, empty living room, the glittering city lights behind my son casting him in a long, lonely silhouette. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the ghosts of a life that had been spectacularly lost. I did not rush to him. I did not offer the soft, comforting words of a mother to a wounded child. The woman who would have done that, the woman who had spent her life rushing to soothe his every scraped knee, to calm his every fear, had died the day she had been cast out of this very apartment. The woman who stood here now was different. She was a woman who understood that some wounds could not be bandaged. They had to be cleaned, disinfected, and allowed to heal from the inside out. A process that was always, inevitably, painful. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing on the bare, polished hardwood floors, and I sat on the floor a few feet away from him, not beside him, not touching him. I just sat, a quiet, steady presence in his self-imposed darkness. For a long time, he did not speak. He just stared out at the city, at the kingdom he had inherited, and then, with a stunning, almost impressive speed, had managed to lose. "She's gone," he said finally, his voice a low, rough, and hollow sound. "Rebecca, she left last week," she said. "She said I was a bad investment." The words were delivered without self-pity, a simple, brutal statement of fact. He had built his life, his marriage, on the transactional logic of his father's business world, and he had been undone by that same, cold, unforgiving logic. "I'm sorry, Tyler," I said, and I meant it. I was sorry for his pain, for his humiliation, for the profound, shattering loss of the life he had thought was his. But I was not sorry for the circumstances that had brought him here. This ruin, this utter and complete collapse, was the only thing that could have ever saved him. We sat in silence for a while longer, to strangers bound by a shared history, a shared name. Finally, I spoke again. "What will you do now?" I asked, my voice a simple, practical question. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "What can I do? I have nothing, Mother, less than nothing. I have debts I will spend the rest of my life paying off. I am a joke, a cautionary tale." "That is one version of your story," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It is not the only one." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes, in the dim light, filled with a weary, cynical disbelief. I had not come here to offer him pity. I had not come here to offer him a financial bailout. I had come here to offer him something far more difficult and far more valuable, a chance. "I am going to make you a proposal, Tyler," I said, my tone the same one I had used with him 6 months ago in my cottage, a tone of quiet, unshakable authority. "It is not a negotiation. It is a what-I'm offer. You can accept it, or you can refuse it. But if you refuse, this is the last conversation we will ever have." I laid out my proposal. It was not a proposal to save his money, but a proposal to save his soul. "You will leave this city," I began. "You will leave this apartment, this life that is no longer yours. You will come to Cape Cod. You will live in the small guest cottage behind my house. It is not large, and it is not luxurious, but it is warm, and it is safe. I paused, letting the first part of the offer sink in. You will find a job, I continued. Any job, it does not matter what it is. You can wash dishes, you can stack shelves, you can mow lawns, but you will work, and you will earn your own money, and from that money, you will begin to pay back your debts. All of them. And finally, I said, my voice softening slightly, you will talk. You will go to therapy. You will sit in a room with a stranger, and you will begin the hard, painful work of dismantling the man you have become and rediscovering the boy you were supposed to be. I was not offering him a rescue. I was offering him a path, a long, difficult, and deeply humbling road to rebuilding his own life from the ground up, on a new foundation of honesty and hard work. I was not offering to save him from the consequences of his actions. I was offering to stand by him while he faced them. He was silent for a long time, the glittering, indifferent city lights reflecting in his hollow eyes. I could see the war within him, the pride, the arrogance, the entitled man who had sneered at me in my own home, was fighting against the small, broken, and terrified boy who just wanted his mother. I had no idea which one would win. I stood up. That is my proposal, Tyler, I said, my voice gentle but final. The door to that cottage is open, but you are the one who has to choose to walk through it. I turned and walked out of the empty, echoing apartment, leaving my son alone in the ruins of his kingdom, with the single, most important choice of his life. I flew back to Cape Cod the next morning, my heart a heavy, uncertain thing. I had made my offer, had laid my cards on the table, and now, all I could do was wait. The quiet, peaceful sanctuary I had built for myself now felt different, charged with a new, anxious energy. Every time a car drove down my quiet, sandy lane, my heart would give a small, hopeful lurch. Every time the phone rang, I would pick it up with a mixture of hope and dread. For a week, there was only silence, a deep, profound, and increasingly painful silence. I began to believe he had made his choice. He had chosen his pride. He had chosen to disappear into the wreckage of his old life, rather than accept the humbling terms of a new one. And I began, slowly and painfully, to mourn my son for a second time. Then, on the 8th day, a battered, old taxi pulled up in front of my cottage. The driver got out and opened the back door, and my son, Tyler, emerged. He was not the powerful, arrogant man who had confronted me in this very house, nor the broken, empty shell I had left in the penthouse. This was a different man. He was thinner, his face pale and drawn, his expensive suit replaced by a simple, ill-fitting pair of jeans and a t-shirt. He was holding a single, worn-out duffel bag. He looked like a refugee, a man who had lost everything, including his own identity. He walked slowly up the path, his gaze fixed on the ground, and stopped before me on the porch. "I'm here," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was a simple statement of fact, a surrender. I did not rush to hug him. I did not offer words of comfort. I simply nodded and led him to the small guest cottage behind my house. It was a simple, one-room space, clean and Spartan, with a bed, a small table, and a view of the ocean. "This is it," I said. "Thank you," he replied, his voice barely audible. And with that, his new life began. The first few weeks were a brutal, silent struggle. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now found himself scrubbing dishes in the hot, steamy kitchen of a local seafood restaurant, the only job he could find on short notice. The man who had once dined at Michelin-starred restaurants now ate his simple meals alone in his small, quiet cottage. He was a ghost in this new world, his old confidence stripped away, leaving behind a raw, awkward, and deeply humbled man. He spoke very little. Our interactions were brief, functional, filled with the vast, unspoken territory of his betrayal and my pain. But he did the work. He showed up for his shift at the restaurant every day. He met with the therapist I had found for him twice a week. He was keeping his end of the bargain. The change began not in our conversations, but in his actions. One afternoon, I came home to find that he had, without being asked, mowed my lawn. Another day, I found that he had fixed the loose, creaking step on my front porch, a small repair I had been meaning to get to for weeks. They were small, silent acts of contrition, a language of service that was the only one he had left. He began to spend his evenings not in his cottage, but in my late husband's old workshop, a small, cluttered space filled with David's old tools and half-finished woodworking projects. He would just sit in there for hours, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's quiet, creative spirit. One evening, I found him in the workshop, not just sitting, but working. He was carefully, painstakingly, sanding a small, intricately carved wooden bird, one of his father's unfinished projects. His hands, once so comfortable with a smartphone and a spreadsheet, were now covered in sawdust. His movements slow, deliberate, and surprisingly gentle. I remember him making this, he said, his voice a low, reflective murmur, not looking at me. He was going to make a mobile of them for a children's hospital. He never got to finish it. In that moment, I saw not the failed CEO or the disgraced son. I saw a man beginning to connect with a part of himself, a part of his father, that had been buried under a lifetime of ambition and greed. Slowly, tentatively, our conversations began to change. They moved from the safe, neutral territory of the weather and the tides to the more difficult, treacherous landscape of the past. He began to talk in his therapy sessions, and then to me, about his relationship with his father, about the immense, unspoken pressure he had felt to live up to David's legacy, a pressure that had made him vulnerable to Sloane's seductive, materialistic vision of success. It was not an excuse, but it was an explanation. It was the beginning of an understanding. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, he came to my house. He stood in the kitchen, his face pale, his eyes filled with a new, hard-won clarity. "I have something for you," he said. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a small, personal check for $500. "It's not much," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "But it's a start." I looked at the check, at the small, almost insignificant number, and I felt a surge of something I had not felt in a very long time. It was hope. The $500 was more than just a payment. It was a symbol. It was the first, hard-earned brick in the new foundation of my son's life, and a quiet, powerful turning point in our own fragile, healing relationship. I did not cash the check. Instead, I framed it and hung it in my small study, a testament not to the money, but to the promise it represented. Tyler continued his slow, arduous journey of rebuilding. He kept his job at the restaurant, the grueling, humbling work a constant, necessary anchor to his new reality. He continued his therapy sessions, slowly, painfully, dismantling the edifice of arrogance and entitlement he had spent a lifetime constructing. Our own conversations became more frequent and more honest. We were learning to talk to each other again, not as a mother and a son, but as two adults, bound by a shared, complicated history. But I knew that washing dishes and attending therapy was not enough. He was surviving, but he was not thriving. He was a man of immense intelligence and talent, a mind that his father had always described as a brilliant, powerful engine, just waiting for the right fuel, the fuel of his old life greed. Status, the relentless pursuit of more had only led to his destruction. He needed a new kind of fuel. He needed a purpose, and I knew, with a quiet certainty, that David had, in his infinite foresight, already left him one. One evening, I brought a box down from the attic. It was filled with David's old files, not from his business, but from his passion. It was his work with the Cape Cod Coastal Trust, a small, local environmental foundation he had co-founded and passionately supported for years. It was the part of his life that had brought him the most joy, his quiet, personal crusade to protect the fragile, windswept beauty of the coastline we had both loved so much. I had taken over his seat on the board after his death, a duty I had performed with a quiet, respectful diligence. "I need your help," I said to Tyler, laying the files on the table between us. "The foundation is planning its annual fundraising gala. It's a logistical nightmare. I know you're good with numbers, with strategy. I was wondering if you might have some ideas." At first, he was hesitant. It was a world so far removed from the high-stakes, predatory world of finance he had once inhabited. But as he began to look through the files, I saw a familiar flicker in his eyes, the spark of his father's brilliant, analytical mind coming back to life. He saw not just a charity event, but a complex, multivariable problem to be solved. He began to talk about optimizing donor engagement, about streamlining event logistics, about maximizing the return on investment for the foundation's mission. He was speaking his old language, the language of the boardroom, but he was applying it to a new, different kind of profit, the profit of a protected coastline, of a cleaner ocean, of a healthier planet. He agreed to volunteer, and he threw himself into the work with a focused, obsessive energy I had not seen since he was a university student. He spent his days at the restaurant, and his nights at my dining room table, surrounded by spreadsheets and donor lists. It was during this time that he met Anya Sharma. She was the foundation's lead marine biologist, a brilliant, passionate, and utterly no-nonsense woman who saw the world not in dollars, but in ecosystems. She was, in every way, the complete and total opposite of Sloan. She was unimpressed by his former life, and deeply skeptical of this former corporate raider who was now trying to save the whales. Their first meeting was a clash of titans. He spoke of optimizing our conservation portfolio. She looked at him with a cool, appraising gaze and said, "The ocean is not a portfolio, Mr. Mercer. It is a living, breathing thing. You cannot manage it. You can only learn to serve it." Her words, a quiet, powerful rebuke to his entire worldview, should have angered him, but instead, I saw a look of grudging, and then genuine, respect dawn on his face. He had met a mind as sharp as his own, but one that was guided by a different, more profound, and ultimately more compelling, set of principles. He began to work with her, to learn from her. She taught him about the fragile, interconnected web of marine life. He, in turn, used his strategic mind to help her secure the funding and the political support she needed to make her research a reality. They were an unlikely team, the fallen capitalist and the passionate scientist. But in their shared work, I saw my son begin to find his new purpose. He was not just volunteering, he was contributing. He was not just paying off a debt, he was building a legacy, a new legacy, one that was aligned not with the hollow, materialistic values of his recent past, but with the deep, quiet, and enduring values of his father. He was, for the first time, becoming a man his father would have been truly, profoundly, and unconditionally proud of. The ashes of his old life were becoming the fertile ground for a new, and far more beautiful, kind of growth. The final piece of Tyler's transformation was not a grand, dramatic event, but a quiet, deeply personal one. A year after his arrival in Cape Cod, the old, abandoned lighthouse at the edge of town, a historic landmark that had fallen into disrepair, was put up for public auction. It was a place David and I had loved, a beautiful, lonely sentinel that had watched over the coastline for 100 years. On the morning of the auction, Tyler came to me, a look of quiet, nervous resolve on his face. He had been saving, meticulously, every spare dollar from his now-to jobs. A restaurant manager by night and a foundation consultant by day. "I want to buy it," he said simply. "Not for myself. For the foundation." For him, it was a beautiful, impossible idea. The property was valuable, and developers had been circling it for years, eager to tear down the old structure and build luxury condos. But Tyler had a different vision. He had spent weeks working with a local historical society, with Enya's environmental team, and with his own, rediscovered strategic mind, to create a new kind of proposal. He didn't just want to buy the lighthouse. He wanted to transform it. He envisioned a community center, a small marine biology research station, a public space that would honor both the history of the town and the environmental legacy of his father. I didn't give him the money. I didn't have to. I simply sat beside him at the tense, crowded town auction, a quiet, steady presence of support. And I watched, with a pride so profound it was a physical ache in my chest, as my son, the man who had once lost millions, stood before the community and fought, not for a profit, but for a principle. He won. His heartfelt, intelligent, and deeply human proposal won the hearts of the town council, who agreed to sell the property to the foundation for a fraction of its market value. The final scene of our story is 6 months later, on a bright, windswept afternoon. We are standing at the base of the newly restored lighthouse. The crumbling brick has been repointed. The glass in the lantern room gleams, and a new, simple sign at the entrance reads, "The David Mercer Center for Coastal Studies." It is the day of the official opening. The entire, small, and vibrant community of Chatham is here, their faces filled with a genuine, unforced joy. Tyler is not on the stage, giving a grand speech. He is in the crowd, talking quietly with a group of local fishermen, listening to their stories, to their wisdom about the changing tides. He is no longer a commander. He is a collaborator. He finds me by the old stone wall overlooking the ocean. He is holding two glasses of champagne. He hands one to me. "To Dad," he says, his voice quiet but clear over the sound of the wind and the waves. "To David," I reply, my voice thick with an emotion I cannot name. We stand there for a long moment, in a comfortable, easy silence, the kind of silence I had once shared with his father. "I have something for you," I say finally. I hand him a thick, elegant envelope. He opens it. Inside is not a check, but a series of photographs and a legal document. It is a deed of gift. "The paintings," he whispers, his voice filled with awe as he looks at the images of the O'Keeffe, the Hopper, the Pollock. I don't understand. They were never about the money, Tyler, I explain. They were a key, a way for me to find my own freedom. And now, they have served their purpose. I had sold one of the paintings, the Pollock, a year ago, a quiet, private sale that had secured my own financial future and had funded the initial seed money for Tyler's lighthouse project. But the other two, the Hopper and the O'Keeffe, the heart of David's secret collection, were too important to be just a number in a bank account. They belong to the world now, I say, pointing to the document. I had donated them, in David's name, to the local art museum, with the single, legally binding condition that they could never be sold and must always remain on public display for the community to enjoy. Tyler looks at me, his eyes shining with a new, profound understanding. He finally sees the full, beautiful, and intricate architecture of his father's love, and of my own. He understands that the real inheritance was never about the money, not for David, and not for me. It was about the legacy, a legacy of community, of purpose, of giving back more than you take. He pulls me into a hug, a real, strong, and heartfelt hug. "I love you, Mom," he says, and in that moment, I know, with a certainty that is as vast and as deep as the ocean before us, that my son has finally, truly, come home. The Brooklyn inheritance had not just given me a new life, it had given me back my son. If this story of a family's long journey back to each other resonated with you, I hope you'll share your own thoughts on what a true legacy means in the comments below. Your story matters. And if you'd like to hear more, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our community.